69 years old, built everything from nothing, raised my daughter with blood, sweat, and silence. At her wedding in front of 900 polished elites, her new father-in-law threw ice water in my face. The music died. The room froze. Water ran down my collar. I didn't flinch. I stood, wiped my eyes, and looked straight at him. "Do you even know who you just humiliated?" His smile collapsed. "Thank you for being here with me. Drop your city or country in the comments," I read everyone. "And if you've ever had to defend your dignity, like and subscribe to support the channel." A quick note, some elements are fictionalized to deepen the impact. Any resemblance to real people or places is unintentional, but the lesson behind it matters. I was seated at table 84, exiled to a dim corner of the grand ballroom, beside the swinging kitchen doors. Each time a waiter burst through carrying a polished silver tray, the heavy wooden door knocked against the back of my chair, as if reminding me exactly where I belonged in that glittering hierarchy. I did not complain. I simply sat there in silence, watching my daughter Arabella drift across the dance floor in her custom silk gown. Under the massive chandelier, its crystals scattering light like shattered diamonds, she looked radiant, untouchable, as though she had finally stepped into the world she believed she deserved. My tuxedo was rented and slightly too tight across the shoulders. The stiff fabric pressed against muscles built from decades of labor no one in that room respected. My hands rough and scarred from years of work, they assumed was ordinary construction, rested quietly on a table covered in plain white cloth. Every other table shimmered in imported silk and gold-threaded runners. Apparently the father of the bride did not qualify for the upgrade. Before I heard his voice, I smelled him an overpowering mix of $100 scotch and expensive cologne. Edmund Beaumont, the groom's father, appeared at my table like a storm cloud dressed in tailored arrogance. He swayed slightly, his posture loose with liquor and superiority, staring down at me as though I were something that had spilled onto his polished marble floor. He did not extend a hand. He did not offer even a courtesy nod. His eyes lingered on the frayed cuffs of my rented jacket with open disgust. "Strathmore," he said, his tone soaked in contempt. "What are you still doing here? Dinner is finished. We're about to begin the VIP corporate photographs for the financial press." I looked up at him steadily. "I'm waiting for the father-daughter dance, Edmund. It's customary for the bride's father to remain until the end of his daughter's wedding." His laugh exploded harshly through the surrounding tables, sharp and performative. Heads turned. Wealthy guests leaned closer, eager for entertainment. "The father of the bride," he repeated mockingly, raising his voice so the surrounding executives and politicians could hear. "Take a good look around you, old man. Do you see anyone here who looks like you? Real estate moguls, senators, CEOs, and then there's you, a retired nobody in a discount suit. You're ruining the aesthetic of my family's legacy simply by breathing in this room. I want you gone before the photographers swing their lenses this direction." A slow heat ignited in my chest. He spoke of legacy as though it were built on champagne and headlines. The irony pressed against my ribs. Through the grueling years, Arabella believed I was simply pouring concrete and patching drywall. I had quietly paid every cent of her Ivy League tuition in full. No loans, no debt, no shortcuts. Just yesterday, when Arabella called me in tears because Edmund refused to cover the $50,000 floral arrangement, too extravagant for his budget. He had claimed I wrote the check without hesitation. The very orchids he stood beside, now towering and fragrant, were purchased by the hands he dismissed as common. Before I could respond, I saw Arabella approaching. My heart lifted instinctively. She gathered the layers of her gown and hurried toward our corner. I offered her a small, reassuring smile, expecting her to intervene to correct the humiliation unfolding in front of half the city's elite. Instead, she stopped in front of me and avoided my eyes. "Dad, please just go," she whispered, her voice tight with embarrassment. "You're making Edmund uncomfortable and Brad is getting upset. Just call a cab. We'll talk later." The words struck deeper than any insult Edmund had thrown. I stared at her, at the girl I had raised alone after her mother passed away, when she was barely old enough to tie her own shoes. I remembered late nights at the kitchen table helping her with algebra weekends, spent working overtime so she could attend private tutoring sessions, and birthdays when I quietly skipped buying myself anything so she could have more. And now, on the most important day of her life, my presence was an inconvenience. "I'm not leaving, Arabella," I said softly but firmly. "I'm your father. I have every right to be here." Edmund's hand slammed down on the table so hard, the silverware rattled violently. "You have no rights here, you pathetic old fool." He spat his face, flushing crimson. "You contributed nothing to this union. My son is elevating your daughter from the dirt she came from. You will walk out right now, or I will have my security escort you through the service elevator like the help." I stood slowly. I was 5 inches taller than him, and despite my age, my shoulders remained broad and solid from a lifetime of discipline. I did not shout. I did not curse. But there was steel in my voice. "You will not touch me, Edmund. And you will not speak to me like that again." His eyes widened, shocked that someone he considered beneath him would dare defy him publicly. Men like Edmund thrived on obedience. Disobedience unsettled them. In a sudden surge of blind, intoxicated rage, he reached across a nearby table, seized a heavy crystal glass filled with ice water, and hurled it directly into my face. The crack of ice striking my cheekbone echoed sharply. Freezing water cascaded down my hair, soaking my collar, and bleeding into the thin fabric of my rented shirt. The chill bit into my skin. The jazz band stopped mid-note. An oppressive silence fell across the ballroom. 900 high society guests turned in unison to witness the spectacle of a drenched old man standing in a forgotten corner. I remained perfectly still. The icy water burned my eyes, but I refused to blink. I slowly wiped my face with the back of my calloused hand and looked beyond Edmund. I looked at Arabella. My daughter, my only child, met my gaze for a brief second. In her eyes I searched for outrage, for loyalty, for something. Instead, she turned away. She gathered her gown and walked back into the sea of whispering executives, disappearing among them, as though she had never known me at all. Something deep inside my chest shifted in that moment. Not shattered, not exploded, but hardened. The water dripping from my jacket was cold, but her silence was colder. She left me standing there. In that single silent moment, something deep inside my chest tore clean in two. The sharp, unbearable ache of a father's heartbreak did not explode outward in tears or rage. It hardened. It compressed. It crystallized into something cold, dense, and utterly merciless. I lifted my rough hand and slowly wiped the freezing water from my eyes. The ballroom remained suspended in suffocating silence. 900 witnesses, crystal chandeliers, silk gowns, imported suits, and in the center of it all, a drenched old man. I looked directly at Edmund Beaumont. His chest rose and fell with arrogant satisfaction. He believed he had won. He believed he had just put a peasant in his place. "Do you really know who you just insulted?" I asked quietly. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but it cut cleanly through the still air. Edmund smirked, though I caught at the faint flicker in his eyes. A brief, involuntary pulse of uncertainty. "Just a broke old man who doesn't know his place," he replied. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I did not lower myself to his level. I simply turned around and walked away. My back remained perfectly straight as I crossed the marble floor. I felt the weight of hundreds of stares pressing into my spine, some mocking, some curious, some uncomfortable. I did not slow down. I did not look back. The heavy glass doors of the luxury hotel opened, and humid night air wrapped around me like a damp curtain. The sounds of laughter and distant music faded behind me, as if the entire evening had already become irrelevant. The valet hurried forward and brought my rusted 2004 pickup truck around to the entrance. It looked almost absurd among the polished foreign sports cars and sleek black luxury sedans lined up beneath the golden lights. I walked to it without hesitation. The torn leather seat groaned beneath me as I climbed in. I shut the door, sealing myself inside the dim, quiet cabin. For a moment, I just sat there staring through the cracked windshield at the glowing hotel entrance. Then I turned the key. The engine sputtered before catching. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. For the briefest second, something human stirred in me. Perhaps Arabella had come to her senses. Perhaps there was an apology waiting late, desperate, ashamed. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. It wasn't her. It was an automated banking alert from my civilian checking account. The blue-white glow illuminated the darkness inside the truck. Insufficient funds. I stared at the words, reading them twice, as if they might rearrange themselves into something else. That account held exactly $100,000, the full amount Arabella believed to be my modest retirement savings, the money she thought I would stretch carefully for the remainder of my life. I tapped the notification. The transaction details loaded slowly, painfully, bar by bar. Wire transfer $100,000. Recipient Bradley Beaumont. Initiated by Arabella Strathmore. The air inside the truck felt suddenly thin. They hadn't just humiliated me in front of 900 people. They hadn't just thrown ice water in my face. They had robbed me. The cold sting on my skin from the water was nothing compared to the deeper, more brutal chill settling in my chest. My own daughter had emptied her father's survival fund, drained it completely, and handed it to the very family that had just treated me like disposable trash. I put the phone down. I drove home in silence. No radio. No heater. My soaked clothes clung to me cold and heavy, but I did not adjust the temperature. I did not need comfort. The streets passed in a blur of dim streetlights and darkened houses. When I pulled into my cracked concrete driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had, modest, quiet, unremarkable. The porch steps creaked beneath my weight as I climbed them. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Darkness greeted me. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I walked directly into the small, aging kitchen and sat down at the scratched wooden dining table. A single street lamp outside filtered through the thin curtains, casting long, distorted shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The house felt still, hollow. I opened my old laptop. The screen flickered to life, its glow harsh against the darkness. I logged into the bank portal without hesitation. My fingers moved steadily, mechanically. The ledger appeared. Balance $0. The number looked almost theatrical. A cruel punchline. I pulled up the scanned image of the wire authorization form. There it was, my signature, or rather a flawless imitation. Years ago, when Arabella was in college, we created that joint account just in case. For emergencies, for safety, for trust. She knew my handwriting intimately. She had seen me sign report cards, checks, birthday cards. She knew the small slant in the S, the firm line in the D. She knew the security questions, the answers to childhood memories only she and I shared. She had used every piece of that knowledge against me. The money had gone to pay Bradley's hidden debts. I had known he was in trouble. I had seen the unopened envelopes carelessly left on their counter. I had noticed the hushed phone calls he stepped outside to take, the subtle sweat on his brow whenever finances were mentioned. But I never imagined this. I never imagined my daughter would forge my name and drain what she believed was my last dollar, all to rescue a man whose family bragged publicly about their supposed millions. A normal father would have collapsed. A normal 69-year-old man who had just lost his entire retirement fund would have picked up the phone, called the police, shouted through tears about betrayal. I did none of that. I did not cry. I did not panic. Instead, something else took hold. A strange, heavy calm settled over me. Not peace, not acceptance. Something colder, something sharper. The man who had raised Arabella, the endlessly patient father in faded flannel, who forgave every mistake, who lived small on purpose, who believed love meant sacrifice, died quietly at that kitchen table. And in his place, something else began to rise. I pushed my chair back from the kitchen table and walked down the narrow hallway into my small, dust-covered home office. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedarwood. It looked ordinary, outdated desk filing cabinet, faded blinds. But nothing in that house was ever as simple as it appeared. I stepped toward the heavy oak bookshelf against the far wall and wrapped my hands around its edges. With a slow, deliberate motion, I shifted it aside. The wood scraped softly across the floor, revealing a small patch of carpet that looked slightly more worn than the rest. I bent down and pulled the carpet back. Beneath it lay a heavy steel floor, safe embedded deep into the concrete foundation of the house. It was industrial-grade, unmarked, and completely invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. I crouched and spun the dial. 32 left, 14 right, 58. The tumblers aligned with a muted metallic click. I pulled the door open. Inside, there was no cash stacked in neat bundles, no gold bars, no photographs of a happier life. There was only a single, sleek, black encrypted burner phone and a thick, leather-bound dossier. I picked up the phone first. It had not been powered on in 5 years. I pressed the button and waited as the screen illuminated the secure operating system booting up. It connected to a highly protected private network that very few people in the world even knew existed. I entered a number from memory, one that only one other human being possessed. It rang exactly once. Strathmore. The voice was crisp, sharp, alert. Jonathan Reed, my corporate estate attorney. In certain financial circles, he was known as a shark. A man who dismantled multinational corporations before breakfast and called it administrative housekeeping. Jonathan, I said evenly, it's time. There was a brief pause. Are you certain, Silas? He asked. You've maintained the civilian facade for over a decade. If we move forward, the camouflage disappears completely. I glanced down at my wrinkled, damp shirt. The cheap fabric still clung faintly to my skin from the ice water. The camouflage was a catastrophic miscalculation, I replied. I wanted my daughter to understand the dignity of hard work. I wanted her grounded. Instead, she grew ashamed of me. She married into a family of parasites, and tonight she helped them steal what she believes is my final dollar. Jonathan's voice shifted instantly, no hesitation, no emotion. What are your instructions? Unseal the Apex Holdings Trust. A beat of silence. Understood. And the target. Edmund Beaumont believes he's royalty, I said, staring at the blank office wall. He thinks he sits on an untouchable throne of wealth and legacy. He just threw ice water in the face of a man he assumes is a broke mechanic. It's time to show him who actually owns the castle. The elevator doors slid open on the 50th floor of a glass and steel skyscraper downtown. Reed and Associates occupied the entire level. The reception area was white marble and brushed steel, cold, sterile, intimidating by design. I stepped out of the elevator and walked forward without slowing. The receptionist looked up briefly, then returned to her screen. She knew better than to ask for my name. Jonathan was waiting in the main boardroom at the end of a long corridor lined with abstract art and recessed lighting. The boardroom was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Sunlight flooded across a massive mahogany conference table polished to a mirror sheen. Jonathan stood at its head, immaculate in a charcoal suit. His silver hair was combed perfectly back. On the table before him were 6 thick manila folders arranged with surgical precision. I sat heavily in one of the oversized leather chairs. I hadn't slept. I had removed the ruined tuxedo jacket, but the cheap white shirt remained collar wrinkled and faintly stained. Jonathan's gaze lingered briefly on my appearance, before he pushed the first folder across the table. I told you to wait, Silas, he said quietly. I warned you years ago that living like a ghost inside your own empire was dangerous. I opened the folder. I don't pay you for philosophical commentary, I replied calmly. Give me the anatomy of the enemy. What is Edmund Beaumont truly made of? Jonathan tapped a page with his gold pen. Smoke and mirrors, he said. Edmund projects the image of an untouchable titan. $1 million weddings, bespoke suits, imported vehicles. But Beaumont Global is hemorrhaging capital. The logistics company survives entirely on high-interest loans and aggressively extended credit lines. They've lost 3 major international shipping contracts in the past 2 quarters alone. He flipped another page. He's siphoning corporate funds to maintain his personal lifestyle. At their current burn rate, they are 6 months from insolvency. I studied the red figures bleeding across the balance sheets. So he's a fraud, I said quietly. A proud man standing on rotten boards, pretending it's reinforced concrete. Exactly, Jonathan replied. But he has one lifeline left. He opened the second folder. Beaumont Global's stock price is anchored to public perception, and that perception hinges on their 40-story corporate headquarters downtown. As long as they occupy that prime, real estate investors assume stability. He met my eyes. Edmund is negotiating a 10-year lease renewal for that building. If he secures it, he can leverage the agreement to obtain a massive private equity bailout. It's his final chance. A slow realization tightened in my chest. And who owns that building, Jonathan? A razor-thin smile curved his lips. Apex Holdings. You purchased it through a subsidiary shell corporation 7 years ago. Edmund Beaumont has been writing rent checks directly into your accounts for nearly a decade. He has absolutely no idea that the man he humiliated at his son's wedding is the landlord of his entire operation. I closed the folder slowly. The irony was almost suffocating. I owned the ground beneath his empire. Jonathan leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. Silas, he said carefully, I've managed your wealth for 20 years. I watched you build Apex Holdings from a single concrete mixing truck into a silation dollar real estate portfolio. Why did you never tell Arabella the truth? If she had known about her inheritance, she would never have chased financial security through a family like the Beaumonts. I stood and walked to the glass window. The city stretched below in miniature cars, crawling along streets, people moving like fragments of shadow. My wife, I said quietly. Jonathan didn't interrupt. When Mary died of cancer, Arabella was 7. We had nothing. I worked 14-hour shifts just to keep heat in a 2-bedroom apartment. The memory pressed heavily against my ribs. On her deathbed, Mary made me promise something. She wanted our daughter raised with humility, with discipline, with respect for every dollar earned. I turned slightly, though my gaze remained on the city. As Apex grew, I watched my colleagues' children implode under sudden wealth, entitlement, addiction, moral decay. They became monsters wrapped in designer clothing. I exhaled slowly. I was terrified of losing Arabella to that lifestyle. I wanted her to build her own foundation, to choose a man who loved her for her mind, not her inheritance. Jonathan's jaw tightened. So you hid everything? Yes. I placed the empire into blind trusts. I kept driving the truck. I stayed in the modest house. I thought I was protecting her. Jonathan shook his head, and instead, it backfired, I admitted. The silence that followed wasn't judgmental. It was clinical. Jonathan returned to the table and opened another folder. Then we proceed strategically, he said. First, we deny the lease renewal. Second, we accelerate the loan recall clauses tied to Beaumont's variable interest agreements. Third, we discreetly acquire their outstanding corporate debt through intermediaries. I walked back to the table and sat down. How long? 60 days, Jonathan replied. 90 at most. I nodded. No public moves yet, I said. I want him confident. I want him negotiating renewal terms while the floor beneath him dissolves. Jonathan's eyes sharpened. You're certain about this, Silas. Once the camouflage drops, the world will know. I folded my hands on the polished wood. My daughter already believes I'm a broke mechanic, I said quietly. There's nothing left to protect. Jonathan gave a single nod. Then we dismantle him. I glanced once more at the skyline outside the glass. Edmund Beaumont thought he sat atop a throne. He had no idea the castle had already changed ownership years ago, and the landlord had just decided to collect. Yes, I admitted the bitter taste of failure thick in my mouth. It backfired in the worst possible way. She didn't learn humility. She learned shame. She resented the struggle. She hated the old truck, the small house, the worn-out flannel shirts. She became so desperate to escape what she thought was poverty that she ran straight into the arms of the first arrogant family that offered her a seat at their private country club. I tried to teach her discipline. Instead, I accidentally taught her to worship wealth. Jonathan said nothing for a moment. Then he opened the final folder and pushed it slowly across the mahogany table. "Then let me show you the true cost of that worship," he said quietly. "Let's talk about your new son-in-law. Let's talk about Bradley Beaumont and the $100,000 your daughter wired last night." I stepped closer and studied the documents. It was a meticulous digital trail timestamps, IP addresses, authorization logs. The wire transfer Arabella had initiated using my forged signature was laid out with clinical precision. "Bradley's problem isn't poor budgeting," Jonathan continued. "It's addiction. Severe gambling addiction. But not at legal casinos where losses can be written off and bankruptcy provides protection. He plays in underground high-stakes poker rooms run by people who don't send polite reminder notices." Jonathan tapped a routing number highlighted in yellow. "That 100,000 didn't go to a domestic lender. It was transferred to an offshore account controlled by a loan shark syndicate operating out of Macau. Arabella drained what she believed was your retirement fund to keep violent men from knocking on her front door." I stared at the numbers. My daughter had committed federal wire fraud to appease criminals. "And here's the deeper problem," Jonathan said, his voice tightening. "That payment was only a gesture of good faith. Bradley still owes them $500,000. The full amount is due by the end of the month. The Beaumont family is illiquid. Edmund refuses to liquidate corporate assets to bail out his son. Bradley is cornered, and Arabella is now legally entangled in his fraudulent transfers. The pieces aligned with brutal clarity. Edmund's company was collapsing. Bradley was drowning in violent debt, and Arabella, my daughter, was their lifeline. Jonathan closed the folder. "We can end Edmund right now," he said. "Terminate the lease renewal, evict Beaumont Global in 30 days, and watch the stock collapse. But if we trigger that chain reaction, Bradley will fall hard, and he'll take Arabella with him. The fraud alone could send her to prison for a decade." The room was silent. I thought about the ice water, about the wedding guests, about Arabella's silk dress as she turned her back on me. "I want you to buy Bradley's debt," I said finally. "Contact the Macau syndicate. Offer a 10% premium. I want Apex Holdings to own every dollar he owes." Jonathan's eyes sharpened. "And Edmund's lease?" "Deny it," I said. "But don't inform them yet. Let him celebrate. Let him plan a corporate victory gala. Then we pull the foundation out in front of everyone." Jonathan nodded once. "They'll hang themselves," he murmured. Later that morning, I drove my rusted 2004 pickup through the wrought iron gates of the Beaumont estate. The lawns were immaculate. Marble fountains gleamed beneath the sun. The stone facade screamed inherited wealth. Hours earlier, I would have felt small here. Now I saw debt disguised as elegance. I parked behind a new imported sports car. From the passenger seat, I lifted a dusty cardboard box filled with Arabella's childhood photo albums. Missing front teeth. Graduation cap. Ice cream on our old porch. It was perfect camouflage. I walked up the stone steps and pressed the illuminated doorbell. After a pause, the heavy oak door opened. Edmund stood there in a silk robe holding a crystal glass of morning bourbon. His eyes narrowed at the sight of my flannel shirt and worn boots. "What do you want, Strathmore?" he demanded. "You embarrassed yourself enough last night." I lowered my head, allowing my shoulders to sag. "I brought Arabella's photo albums," I said softly. "She left them in my attic. I thought she might want them." Edmund sneered and stepped aside reluctantly. "Leave them on the table. Don't touch anything else." I walked into the cavernous living room. High ceilings, Italian leather furniture, crystal chandelier. Bradley lounged on the sofa in designer golf attire. My gaze went straight to his wrist. A brand new, solid gold luxury watch gleamed in the sunlight. $40,000 easily. I recognized the model instantly. Before entering, I had activated the high-definition recorder on the encrypted phone in my pocket. Every word now mattered. "That's a beautiful watch, Bradley," I said quietly. "Did you buy it with the 100,000 you and Arabella took from my account?" Bradley laughed. Loud. Hollow. He rose and approached me, admiring his wrist. "It's a wedding gift to myself," he said. "Think of it as your contribution to your daughter's upgraded life. She's a Beaumont now. Your little savings finally did something useful." I forced my eyes downward, masking the rage rising in my chest. "Arabella forged my signature," I said softly. "That's federal wire fraud. Why did you push her into that?" Bradley poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter, entirely at ease. "I didn't push her," he replied lazily. "She volunteered. She understands loyalty now. Something you never taught her." "Loyalty?" I asked. "To family," he said, smirking. "She chose the right one." I looked up at him slowly. "She committed a felony." He shrugged. "You're not going to report her. You're too weak for that." Edmund re-entered the room, irritation visible. "This conversation is over," he snapped. "Take your memories and leave." Bradley sipped his drink. "Actually," he added casually, "you should be grateful. That payment bought us time." "How much time?" I asked. Bradley's smirk faltered for half a second. "Enough," he said. "Enough for what I pressed gently." "For me to handle it," he replied sharply. "With what money?" I asked. Silence. Edmund's eyes narrowed. "Strathmore," he warned. I kept my voice fragile. "You owe more, don't you?" Bradley's jaw tightened. 500,000, he muttered before he could stop himself. The recorder captured every syllable. "And if you don't pay?" I asked quietly. Bradley laughed again, but it sounded thinner. "I will." "How?" "Don't worry about it." Edmund stepped closer. "Get out." I lifted the box of photo albums and walked toward the door. At the threshold I paused. "For what it's worth," I said softly. "I hope she understands what she's tied to." Edmund scoffed. "She understands perfectly." I stepped outside into the sunlight. The door closed behind me. As I walked to my truck, I felt no anger, no humiliation, only clarity. Inside my pocket, the recording continued until I pressed stop. Bradley had confirmed the debt, confirmed the fraud, confirmed the desperation. They believed they had taken everything from me. They had no idea I now owned the $500,000 standing between Bradley and men who didn't negotiate twice. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. For the first time since the wedding, I allowed myself a small, cold smile. The man they mocked was not powerless. He was patient, and patience when paired with leverage was far more dangerous than rage. "I didn't make her do anything," Strathmore Bradley said smugly, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass before taking a slow sip. "Arabella is intelligent. She knew I had a few aggressive creditors pressing me over some unfortunate investments. She also knew my father's wealth is currently tied up in corporate assets, so she proposed a temporary solution. We tapped into your little emergency fund, a bit of creative accounting. She signed the withdrawal authorization, the money disappeared offshore, and that's the end of it. You will never see that money again. I suggest you return to your tiny house and pretend you never had a daughter." His words carried no hesitation, no flicker of remorse. He spoke as though confessing to rearranging furniture. Edmund stepped into the living room, irritation etched across his face. He pointed firmly toward the front door. "You heard my son," he said sharply. "Your money is gone. And frankly, you should consider it repayment for us taking your daughter off your hands. You're irrelevant to this family now. Leave the albums and get off my property before I have you removed for trespassing." I lowered my head slightly, allowing my shoulders to sag in convincing defeat. Every movement deliberate, every breath controlled. Without protest, I turned toward the hallway and began walking toward the grand foyer. I dragged my boots just enough to sell the illusion of a broken man retreating from humiliation. But as I passed Edmund's expansive mahogany study, the door stood slightly open. I glanced inside. Spread across the pristine leather desk were 3 thick stacks of legal documents. Even from several feet away, my trained eyes immediately recognized the bright red stamps screaming across the top pages. Notice of default and intent. to foreclose. Final warning. The letters were bold, aggressive, unmistakable. I did not pause. I did not allow my steps to change rhythm. I continued down the hallway as though I had seen nothing. Jonathan had been correct. The Beaumonts were drowning. They occupied a mansion, likely leveraged to its limits. They operated a company hemorrhaging capital. They flaunted luxury watches purchased with stolen money to maintain the illusion of royalty. And Bradley had just openly admitted on a high-definition recording to federal wire fraud, naming my daughter as a willing participant. I stepped through the heavy oak doors and into the bright afternoon light. The air felt different now, clearer. I climbed into my rusted truck and turned the key. I did not feel humiliated. I felt informed. The Beaumonts believed they had crushed a powerless old man. They had no idea the man they mocked held the leverage to legally dismantle their entire world. By the time evening descended, I sat in the leather chair inside Jonathan's private office, the skyline glowing behind floor-to-ceiling windows as city lights flickered on one by one. We had worked for 6 consecutive hours. Layer by layer, we were constructing something precise, something irreversible. Jonathan moved with surgical focus, outlining a web of shell corporations designed to conceal the source of the impending collapse. I'm establishing 3 holding entities, he explained, without looking up. A Delaware firm to acquire Edmund's corporate debt. A London proxy to purchase his outstanding commercial credit lines, and will route Bradley's offshore gambling markers through a Cayman-based private equity shell. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. By the time they realize every creditor is suddenly owned by the same silent entity, the trap will already be closed. I sipped black coffee from a paper cup, the bitterness grounding me. Do it, I said quietly. I want every dollar they owe. I want the paper on their cars, the mortgage on their house, the contracts inside that hollow company. I want control of the air inside their empire. Jonathan nodded once and began placing secure calls. For the first 30 minutes, everything unfolded flawlessly. The Macau syndicate accepted a 10% premium, Jonathan said, as he confirmed the transaction. Violence is messy. Liquid cash is preferable. We now own Bradley's markers. The words carried weight. We now owned Bradley's life. But then Jonathan's typing slowed, stopped. A crease formed between his brows as he stared at a flashing red alert on his terminal. We have a complication, he said, tension sharpening his voice. I leaned forward. Explain. There's another buyer targeting Edmund's corporate debt, he said quickly, pulling up fresh data. A New York vulture capital firm, Vanguard Acquisitions. The name meant something. They specialize in distressed logistics firms, Jonathan continued. They buy toxic debt for pennies, liquidate assets immediately, and exit with profit. He turned the screen toward me. They've just submitted a bulk offer to the primary bank, holding Beaumont's commercial loans. They're attempting to acquire the entire debt portfolio in one sweep. My jaw tightened. If they succeed, Jonathan's expression hardened. Vanguard will dismantle Beaumont Global within days. They'll terminate employees, auction off trucks, liquidate contracts, and push Edmund into structured bankruptcy. I considered that. That's not what we want, I said. Jonathan shook his head. No. If Vanguard controls the debt, Edmund loses his company, but he keeps his narrative. He becomes the tragic executive destroyed by aggressive Wall Street predators. Bankruptcy court shields him from personal ruin. He avoids public humiliation. He never learns you were behind it. The room felt colder. All of this planning, Jonathan added quietly, depends on us controlling the debt. If Vanguard closes first, your leverage disappears. I stood and walked toward the glass window. Below us, traffic flowed like arteries through the city. If Vanguard wins, I asked carefully, can we outbid them? Jonathan exhaled slowly. We can, but it will be expensive. They're offering to buy the portfolio at 60 cents on the dollar. That's aggressive for distressed logistics assets. Offer 70, I said immediately. Jonathan turned toward me. That escalates visibility. Then structure it through the London proxy, I replied. Layer it twice if necessary. He hesitated, You're certain you want to engage in a bidding war? Yes. He studied my face. You're no longer just dismantling a rival, Silas. This is becoming personal. It was always personal, I said evenly. Jonathan returned to his desk and began recalculating figures. We'll need immediate liquidity from Apex Holdings Reserve Trust, he muttered. And we'll have to move before markets open tomorrow. Do it, I repeated. His fingers resumed their rapid motion. Minutes passed in tense silence. Finally, Jonathan leaned back. Our counteroffer is submitted. Vanguard will have 12 hours to respond. And if they escalate, we escalate further. I nodded. The trap could not merely snap shut. It had to close with precision. I returned to my seat and folded my hands together. Edmund believed he stood at the edge of victory. He was planning a gala to celebrate his lease renewal, unaware the renewal was already denied. Bradley believed his debt problem was temporarily solved, unaware the debt now belonged to me, and now a third predator had entered the field. Vanguard sought profit. I sought accountability. Jonathan looked up from his screen. If we win this, Edmund doesn't just lose his company, he said quietly. He loses control of the story. That's the point, I replied. Outside, the skyline shimmered in artificial light. For years I had lived quietly beneath the surface, invisible. Tonight, the invisible man was bidding for control of a collapsing empire. And this time, I would not allow another predator to steal the satisfaction of watching it fall. I felt a surge of cold anger. Edmund Beaumont was not going to escape into the comfort of a standard bankruptcy. He was not going to get a quiet exit. He had publicly humiliated me. His son had manipulated my daughter into stealing my life savings. I was not going to let a faceless New York firm steal my execution. Counter their bid. I ordered, my voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. Jonathan hesitated. Silas Vanguard offered $12 million for the debt portfolio. The portfolio itself is barely worth $8 million in actual recoverable assets. If we outbid them, you will be intentionally losing millions of dollars just to secure the rights to destroy this man. It is a terrible financial move. I looked at the brilliant city skyline. I remembered the freezing shock of the ice water hitting my face. I remembered the absolute silence of the 900 guests. I remembered the agonizing sight of Arabella turning her back on me. I did not build a billion-dollar empire to worry about a few $1 million, Jonathan, I said smoothly. I built it so I would never have to bow to men like Edmund Beaumont. Offer $15 million right now. Jonathan swallowed hard, realizing the absolute depths of my resolve. He nodded, once his fingers flying across the keyboard as he drafted the counteroffer. He submitted the bid directly to the primary bank. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning. We waited. 5 minutes felt like 5 agonizing years. If Vanguard countered again, we would be locked in a blind bidding war that could draw unwanted media attention and expose my identity too early. Then Jonathan's phone rang. He picked it up, listened for 10 seconds, and hung up. He let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. The bank accepted our offer. Jonathan said, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. Vanguard backed down. The premium was too high for their profit margins. It is done, Silas. The Delaware Shell Company now officially holds every single note of Edmund Beaumont's corporate debt. You own the company. You own his son. You hold all the cards. I stood up from the leather chair. Keep the transfer absolutely quiet, I instructed. I do not want Edmund to know his loans have been sold until I am standing directly in front of him. I left the high-rise building and drove my rusted truck back to my quiet, dark neighborhood. The sheer weight of what I had just accomplished settled heavily on my shoulders. I held the absolute power to wipe an entire wealthy family off the map. It was a terrifying amount of control, but my conscience was completely clear. They had dug this grave with their own overwhelming arrogance and endless greed. I was simply the man buying the dirt to bury them. The next morning, the sun rose over my small suburban house, casting a warm light over the cracked driveway. I walked out to the rusted mailbox at the end of the street. Inside, amidst the grocery flyers and utility bills, was a thick, heavy envelope. It was made of expensive cream-colored paper, sealed with a prominent gold wax stamp bearing the Beaumont family crest. I walked back into my kitchen, grabbed a small knife, and sliced the heavy envelope open. Inside was a formal, heavily embossed invitation. Edmund Beaumont, CEO of Beaumont Global, cordially invites you to a grand corporate gala celebrating the dawn of a lucrative new merger and the permanent expansion of our legacy. I stared at the golden letters. Edmund was throwing a massive party to celebrate the survival of his company. He truly believed he had secured the 10-year lease renewal on the headquarters building. He believed he had convinced his private equity investors that a new merger was going to save them all. He was gathering all the wealthy executives, the politicians, and the high society elite into one room to boast about his untouchable success. But Edmund had not sent me this invitation. A man like Edmund would never invite the blue-collar father he had just thrown out of a wedding. I turned the heavy card over. Taped to the back of the invitation was a small piece of custom stationery. I immediately recognized the elegant looping handwriting. It was Arabella. I read the handwritten note, and every single word felt like a poisoned needle slipping directly into my heart. Dad, I know you are probably still angry about the wedding and the money, but Bradley and I thought you should see what real success actually looks like. The Beaumonts are closing a deal this weekend that will secure our family for generations. This is the world I belong in now, a world of real power, not just struggling to pay the heating Silas every winter. I sent you this invitation so you can come and see for yourself. Maybe if you see what Edmund has built, you will finally understand why I had to leave your small life behind. Do not wear the rented tuxedo if you decide to show up. I placed the note gently on the kitchen counter. I did not feel the sting of betrayal anymore. That part of me was already dead and buried. My own daughter had stolen my survival money to pay off her husband's gambling debts, and now she was cruelly mocking my perceived poverty. She was using her new father-in-law's fake success as a weapon to make me feel small. She wanted me to stand in the back of another grand ballroom and watch them celebrate their stolen, fraudulent wealth. I picked up the heavy gold invitation and slid it carefully into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. When I am going to attend your party, Arabella, I whispered to the empty room. I am going to walk into that ballroom, and I am going to show you and your new family what real power actually looks like. You wanted to leave my small life behind to join an empire. I am going to make sure you have absolutely front-row seats when I burn that empire to the ground. I returned to Jonathan's high-rise office on Thursday morning. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a heavy, overcast gray. It perfectly matched the cold and clinical atmosphere inside the boardroom. Laid out across the polished mahogany table were dozens of thick legal documents. They were neatly organized into separate stacks, each one representing a different structural pillar of the Beaumont family empire. I sat down in the heavy leather chair and picked up the solid gold pen Jonathan had placed next to the paperwork. This was the moment of execution. I pulled the first stack toward me. These were the commercial eviction notices for Beaumont Global. By signing my name on the dotted line, I was legally authorizing the immediate termination of Edmund's 40-story corporate headquarters lease. I was ordering the locks to be changed and the property to be seized. I signed the bottom of the page without a single ounce of hesitation. I moved on to the second stack of papers. These were the aggressive debt call-ins for Edmund's logistics company. I was demanding the immediate repayment of the $15 million in corporate loans I had purchased through my Delaware shell company. I was stripping away his safety net and exposing his massive fraud to the banking sector. I signed those pages with a steady hand. My signature felt like a loaded weapon. I reached for the third and final stack of documents. This was the paperwork regarding Bradley's $500,000 offshore gambling debt. This was the absolute kill shot. But before the tip of my pen could touch the heavy paper, Jonathan reached out and placed his hand firmly over the documents. I looked up at him. His face was entirely serious, stripped of his usual predatory courtroom confidence. "We need to have a very clear conversation before you sign those papers," Silas Jonathan said quietly, his tone stripped of its usual sharp efficiency. "You must understand the full legal reality of what happens the moment I file these documents with the federal authorities." I leaned back slowly in the leather chair and studied him. "Explain," I said. Jonathan folded his hands on the table. "If we aggressively call in Bradley's gambling debt," he began, "we trigger a mandatory financial audit. His recent transactions will be scrutinized in detail to prove insolvency. The banking authorities will trace every dollar he's moved in the past 90 days. That trail leads directly to the $100,000 wire transfer from your civilian joint account." "I'm aware," I replied evenly. "That's precisely why we're doing this. I want Bradley exposed." Jonathan shook his head, removing his hand from the document I was about to sign. "You're focusing on him. I'm focusing on the collateral damage." He paused deliberately. "Bradley didn't forge your signature at the bank. Arabella did. Her name is on the withdrawal slip. Her face is on the branch security footage. When federal investigators examine this wire fraud, they will indict her as well. She knowingly transferred stolen funds to an international criminal syndicate to settle illegal debts. If you sign, you're not just dismantling the Beaumont family. You are delivering your daughter to the federal justice system." The boardroom fell silent. "She could face up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary," Jonathan added quietly. The words pressed down on me like concrete. I stared at the blank signature line. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, the ice around my heart cracked. I saw Arabella as a child, pedaling her bright red bicycle in our cracked driveway. I remembered the way she squeezed my hand at her mother's funeral, rain soaking through our coats, while she tried to be brave. I remembered working double shifts, my back burning, so she could wear a beautiful dress to prom instead of something discounted from clearance racks. She was my blood, my only child, the last piece of family I had. A normal father would stop here. A normal father would swallow the financial loss, burn the documents, and shield his daughter from consequences. A normal father would allow arrogant predators to win if it meant keeping his child out of a prison cell. But I wasn't standing in that wedding ballroom anymore. I remembered the shock of ice water striking my face. I remembered the silence of 900 guests. I remembered searching Arabella's eyes for loyalty and watching her turn away. I remembered the note she had written on the back of the gala invitation, mocking the smallness of my life and praising the royalty she had married into. She hadn't been coerced. She hadn't been manipulated. She had chosen. She chose greed over loyalty, status over integrity, parasites over the man who built his life around her survival. I looked at Jonathan. The last remnant of paternal mercy inside me quietly withered. "She made her bed," I said, my voice hard as forged steel. "Let her sleep in it." I pulled the gold pen toward me and signed my full legal name with steady precision. No tremor, no hesitation. I slid the final stack of papers across the mahogany table. "File everything," I said as I rose to my feet. "But time it perfectly. I want federal marshals and eviction teams arriving exactly when Edmund steps onto that stage at his corporate gala Saturday night. I want high society to watch their empire collapse in real time." Jonathan gathered the documents carefully into his leather briefcase. By Sunday morning, he said quietly, "They won't have enough cash for black coffee." When I stepped into the city streets, the air felt different, lighter. I was no longer the man humiliated in a corner. I was the architect of what came next. I drove halfway home before my secure phone rang. Unknown corporate number. I pulled onto the shoulder of the interstate and answered. "Hello. Good afternoon, Mr. Strathmore," a bright professional voice said. "This is First National Bank Premium Mortgage Division. We're calling regarding final approval for the $4 million luxury estate being purchased by your daughter Arabella and Bradley Beaumont." I remained still. "Continue. They've listed you as primary financial guarantor. We have documentation stating you are sole beneficiary of a substantial corporate trust securing this mortgage. We need verbal confirmation of your intent to back the loan before releasing funds this afternoon. The audacity nearly made me laugh. They had discovered the trust, forged a letter of credit, leveraged my hidden assets behind my back to purchase a mansion they could never afford. They believed I would remain silent once the funds cleared. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "I'm afraid those documents are fraudulent," I said calmly. "I am not backing their mortgage. My daughter and her husband are financially insolvent. In fact, they are under active federal investigation for international wire fraud." Silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Sir, are you certain?" the underwriter asked, panic creeping into his tone. "This will trigger immediate default. The escrow will collapse. We will be required to report the forged guarantor documents." "I am absolutely certain," I replied. "Cancel the loan." I ended the call and placed the phone on the passenger seat. The trap was no longer theoretical. It was closing, bone by bone. That evening, I stood in the private fitting room of the most exclusive tailor in the city. Dark polished mahogany walls, imported wool draped along brass racks, the scent of leather and cedar filling the air. For 20 years, I had worn frayed collars and faded denim intentionally, discount jackets, scuffed boots. I cultivated the image of a modest, struggling father. Now that disguise was no longer necessary. The tailor circled me with measuring tape, his voice low and respectful. "Hand-stitched Italian wool," he suggested. "Midnight charcoal, subtle but commanding." "Make it precise," I said. He adjusted the fabric across my shoulders. "You have the build of someone who works with his hands," he observed. "I do," I replied quietly. But now those hands would no longer pour concrete. They would sign papers and pull levers. When he finished pinning the jacket, I looked at myself in the mirror. For years I hid behind humility. Now I saw something else staring back. Not rage, not vengeance. Control. The man who sat at table 84 in a dark corner beside the kitchen doors was gone. In his place stood someone deliberate, measured, prepared. Saturday night would not be about anger. It would be about revelation. Edmund Beaumont would step onto his stage believing he had secured his legacy. Bradley would believe his debt had been postponed. Arabella would believe her world was stabilizing. And in a single synchronized moment, the foundation beneath them would vanish. I buttoned the tailored jacket and straightened the cuffs. For decades I built an empire in silence. This weekend I would dismantle one just as quietly, but far more publicly. And this time no one would mistake me for irrelevant again. Today that pathetic illusion was officially dead. The master tailor, an older Italian gentleman with a soft measuring tape draped around his neck, carefully adjusted the broad shoulders of the bespoke $10,000 suit I was wearing. It was woven from a flawless midnight blue charcoal wool that felt incredibly heavy and powerful. When I looked straight ahead into the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror, I did not see the tired, broken old man who had been publicly humiliated and banished to table 84. I saw the founder and the absolute ruler of Apex Holdings. I saw a man who possessed the financial firepower to buy and sell the entire Beaumont family before his morning coffee. The master tailor took a step back and nodded his head with a look of deep professional respect. "It fits you absolutely perfectly, Mr. Strathmore," he said softly, smoothing out a microscopic wrinkle on the lapel. "You look exactly like a man who owns the entire world." I looked at my cold reflection in the glass and slowly adjusted the expensive cuffs. "I do own it," I replied quietly. I took the heavy garment bag home and laid the pristine suit carefully across my bed. Then I walked directly to my closet and began pulling out the past. I grabbed every single worn-out flannel shirt, every pair of grass-stained jeans, and every cheap canvas jacket I owned. I gathered my scuffed work boots and my faded baseball caps. I carried the heavy, pathetic pile out to the cracked concrete patio in my small backyard. I tossed every single item into the large, rusted metal fire pit I usually used to burn fallen leaves in the autumn. I went into the garage, grabbed a large plastic container of chemical lighter fluid, and poured a thick, heavy stream over the mountain of cheap fabric. I struck a single wooden match against the brick wall and tossed it directly into the center of the pit. The flames erupted instantly with a loud whoosh, sending a towering plume of thick black smoke high into the gray afternoon sky. I stood perfectly still on the concrete and watched my entire civilian identity turned to black ash. As the heat washed over my face, I realized that my decades of extreme personal sacrifice had been completely pointless. I had intentionally made myself small, hoping it would teach my daughter to be humble and grounded. Instead, my smallness had only given her and her arrogant new family a convenient excuse to step all over me. I watched the frayed collar of my favorite red flannel shirt curl up and completely blacken in the raging fire. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold and brilliant clarity. The weak, forgiving father was burning away, leaving only the ruthless executioner behind. As the aggressive fire began to die down into a bed of glowing red embers, my secure cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing digital screen. It was a text message from Arabella. It was the very first time she had reached out to me since she turned her back on me and walked away at the wedding reception. I opened the message expecting perhaps a shred of panicked remorse or at least a frantic question about why her massive luxury mansion mortgage had been suddenly completely denied by the bank. Instead, I read a message so dripping with absolute delusion and sickening entitlement that it almost made me laugh out loud. "Dad," the message read, "you completely ruined the elegant aesthetic of our VIP wedding photos with your dramatic little stunt last night. Edmund is still furious, and Bradley is under a massive amount of stress because of your embarrassing public behavior. We decided we desperately need to get away from all this toxic, negative energy. We are booking a first-class honeymoon trip to a luxury resort in Dubai. Since you ruined our special day, the absolute least you can do is pay for the first-class flights and the private villa. Wire $50,000 to my new joint account by tonight. Consider it your formal apology to the Beaumont family." I stood alone in my quiet backyard and read her impossible words over and over again. My own flesh and blood, who had just committed massive federal wire fraud to steal my supposed life savings, was now demanding an additional $50,000 to fund an exotic luxury vacation. She actually believed she held the absolute moral high ground. She truly believed that I owed her a massive financial apology for having a glass of freezing ice water violently thrown into my face. The sheer, blinding magnitude of her greed was totally staggering. She was standing proudly on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, demanding that I purchase a more expensive deck chair for her to lounge in. She no longer considered herself a Strathmore. She explicitly called herself a Beaumont. I did not type out a long, emotionally exhausted response. I did not threaten her with the federal police or mention the forged bank documents. I simply typed a single, devastating sentence. "Enjoy the weekend, Arabella, because it is the absolute last one you will ever be able to afford." I pressed the send button and watched the message turn green. Then I opened my phone settings and permanently blocked her personal number. I blocked her social media accounts and her email address. She was completely cut off. She was no longer my beloved daughter. She was simply acceptable collateral damage in the total war she had foolishly helped start. Less than 10 minutes later, the phone rang in my hand. It was Jonathan. His voice was sharp, clipped, and filled with a dark, professional satisfaction. "The board is officially set," he said over the secure line. "I just received the final confirmation from our newly acquired debt collection teams. I authorized the Macau syndicate operatives, who now work legally under our corporate umbrella, to pay a very personal daytime visit to your arrogant new son-in-law." I looked down at the dark smoke rising slowly from the hot fire pit. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. Jonathan chuckled softly, a sound devoid of any real humor. Bradley Beaumont was enjoying a lavish private lunch on the beautiful outdoor terrace of his exclusive country club, he explained. He was drinking incredibly expensive imported champagne and laughing loudly with his wealthy golf friends. Then, three large men, wearing dark tailored suits, walked right past the intimidated country club security guards and stepped onto the private terrace. They walked directly over to Bradley's table and sat down in the empty chairs right across from him. They did not say a single word. They just sat there perfectly still, staring holes through him while they casually drank his expensive scotch on your dime. I pictured Bradley's arrogant face suddenly draining of all its color. "Go on," I said. One of our operatives approached him casually. Jonathan said over the secure line, his tone clinical and precise. He slipped a folded photocopy of Bradley's $500,000 gambling marker onto the glass table in front of him. No threats, no raised voices, just paper. I could almost see it unfolding. Bradley recognized them immediately. Jonathan continued. He went pale, dropped his champagne glass. It shattered across the stone terrace. Every head at the club turned. He stood there frozen for half a second. Then panic took over. He bolted. I closed my eyes briefly listening. He tried to run to his sports car in the valet lot, Jonathan said. But his hands were shaking so badly, he dropped his keys on the grass. He couldn't even pick them up properly. Silas. He knows. He knows the syndicate has found him in broad daylight. He knows the debt is due, and he knows he has no money left to pay it. A slow breath left my lungs. Bradley Beaumont, the arrogant boy who had laughed in my face and flaunted his $40,000 watch, was now running across a suburban golf course like prey sensing a hunter. He had believed himself untouchable. He thought stealing from a quiet old man carried no consequence. Now the violent reality of his recklessness stood inches from him, wearing tailored jackets and polite smiles. "He's terrified," Jonathan added. "Keep the pressure steady," I replied calmly. No violence, no escalation, just presence. Let him run. Let him feel the walls closing. Let him understand there is nowhere left in this city to hide. I ended the call. For a long moment I stood alone in my quiet living room. The past humiliation, betrayal, ice water, laughter felt like ashes. I walked down the hallway, locked the front door, and entered my bedroom. Hanging on the closet door was the midnight blue suit I had commissioned only days earlier. $10,000 worth of hand-stitched wool, tailored to perfection. Tomorrow night, Edmund Beaumont would host his grand corporate gala to celebrate a success that did not exist. Tomorrow night his illusion would fracture publicly, and I would be dressed appropriately. The following evening, I drove my rusted 2004 pickup into the heart of the financial district. Skyscrapers of steel and glass reflected the fading orange of sunset. The city buzzed with weekend energy laughter echoing from rooftop bars and luxury restaurants. Inside the cab of my truck, silence reigned. I wore the bespoke midnight blue suit. The fabric felt dense, protective, less like clothing, more like armor. For years, I had navigated these same streets in faded flannel and stained denim, deliberately obscuring my wealth beneath the persona of a tired working man. Tonight the mask was gone. I was driving to the 40-story headquarters of Beaumont Global, the building I owned. The grand avenue leading to the entrance had been transformed into a spectacle. Velvet ropes, polished brass stanchions, private security teams, and rows of imported sedans idled patiently beneath bright white lights. Limousines, European sports cars, glossy black SUVs. I did not join the queue. Instead, I guided my battered pickup directly to the front, cutting off a pristine silver Mercedes. A young valet in a crisp red uniform rushed forward, horror flashing across his face. He waved urgently, clearly assuming I had mistaken the location. I placed the truck in park and opened the creaking metal door. When I stepped onto the red carpet, he froze. His eyes moved from the cracked windshield of my truck to the clean lines of my custom suit. The midnight blue fabric caught the floodlights with quiet authority. The contrast confused him. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the keys, and wrapped them in a crisp $100 Silas before placing them in his stunned hand. "Keep it near the front," I said evenly. "I won't be long." He nodded reflexively, still processing the contradiction standing before him. I turned and walked up the carpet. Cameras flashed. Photographers shouted names of corporate executives as they arrived. To them, I was simply another wealthy figure joining the celebration. They did not recognize the face beneath the tailored composure. They did not realize I was the silent landlord of the tower towering above them. The double-glass doors ahead gleamed beneath chandelier light. 4 security guards stood behind a braided velvet rope immovable as statues. Black suits, clear earpieces, professional detachment. I approached without hesitation. The head of security, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, disciplined, raised a hand. "Good evening, sir," he said, scanning the cut of my suit with measured respect. "May I have your last name for verification?" "Strathmore," I replied smoothly. "Silas Strathmore." He scrolled through the digital tablet, paused, scrolled again. His brow furrowed. "I apologize, Mr. Strathmore," he said carefully. "Your name is not listed on the executive guest registry. This is a private corporate event. I'll need you to step aside." I remained still. The air shifted slightly. 2 additional guards moved closer, arms crossing, preparing for removal. Only days earlier, I had stood in a ballroom corner, while men like this treated me as disposable. Tonight I felt nothing. No anger, no insecurity, only control. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew a sleek black card embossed, understated, unmistakable. The name at the top read, Apex Holdings. The security chief's posture changed the instant he read it. "I believe," I said quietly, "there's been a misunderstanding." He glanced down at his tablet once more, then back at the card. Recognition dawned slowly. "Sir," he began cautiously, "Apex Holdings is listed as the property owner. I finished for him." Silence stretched between us. Behind the glass doors, laughter echoed from the atrium. Edmund Beaumont was likely rehearsing his speech about growth, resilience, and stability. The security chief stepped aside. "Please forgive the oversight, Mr. Strathmore." The velvet rope was lifted. I walked forward without another word. Inside, the atrium glittered with chandeliers and mirrored surfaces. Champagne flutes shimmered beneath ambient lighting. Corporate banners displayed Beaumont Global's logo in confident gold lettering. Executives mingled, investors smiled, photographers adjusted lenses. Everything appeared intact. For now, I moved calmly through the crowd, unnoticed but observant. Across the room, I saw Edmund Beaumont speaking animatedly to a cluster of board members. His suit immaculate, his confidence restored. He believed the lease renewal secured, the bailout imminent. Bradley stood near the bar posture, stiff, scanning the room nervously, despite his forced grin. The men from Macau were somewhere nearby, watching. The orchestra softened as the lights dimmed slightly. A spotlight illuminated the stage. Edmund stepped toward the podium to applause. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began warmly, "tonight we celebrate not just resilience, but triumph." His voice echoed against marble and glass. I took a step closer to the center of the atrium. Behind me, unseen by most guests, 2 men in dark suits entered quietly through a side corridor. Federal credentials tucked inside their jackets. Outside, discreet corporate eviction teams were positioning themselves in coordination. Jonathan had timed it perfectly. Edmund continued speaking about stability, legacy, and the bright future ahead. I felt no excitement, only inevitability. The man who once forced me into a corner now stood under blinding light, unaware the foundation beneath him had already been revoked. A security guard approached me quietly. "Sir," he whispered, "federal officers are requesting immediate access to Mr. Beaumont." I nodded slightly. "Let them through." Across the atrium, I saw Bradley stiffen as 2 men approached Edmund at the podium. The applause faltered. Confusion rippled through the crowd. A whisper spread. Papers were handed over. Edmund's confident smile flickered. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. The red carpet outside still shimmered beneath camera lights. But inside the tower, my tower, the illusion had begun to crack. And this time I did not stand in the shadows. I stood in the open, perfectly composed, as the empire built on arrogance began to fracture under the weight of its own lies. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not show a single ounce of panic or anger. I slowly reached my right hand inside the breast pocket of my tailored jacket. The 3 guards tensed up immediately, expecting me to pull out a weapon or perhaps a massive bribe. Instead, I pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of heavy legal paper. It was not a weapon, but in this specific environment, it was something infinitely more dangerous. I unfolded the crisp document and handed it calmly over the velvet rope directly to the head of security. I highly suggest you read that document very carefully before you decide to put your hands on me or tell me where I am allowed to stand. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. The massive security chief took the paper from my hand. He looked deeply annoyed at first, clearly thinking I was handing him a fake invitation or a useless business card. But then his eyes scanned the bold black text printed across the top of the page. Certified deed of commercial property ownership. He read the exact address listed on the document. It was the absolute precise address of the 40-story skyscraper we were currently standing in front of. He read the name of the parent holding company, Apex Holdings. And finally, his eyes slowly dragged down to the bottom of the page where he read the name of the sole authorized executive and absolute owner of that holding company, Silas Strathmore. The head of security slowly looked up from the heavy paper. All the blood had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and terrified. He looked at my calm, unblinking eyes, and the devastating reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He realized that he was actively attempting to throw the supreme legal landlord of the entire building out onto the street. He realized that the quiet man standing in front of him possessed the absolute legal authority to fire his entire security firm, cancel the massive corporate event inside, and lock the glass doors of the building forever with a single phone call. Sir. The security chief stammered, his voice completely cracking, as he handed the heavy document back to me with violently trembling fingers. I am so incredibly sorry, Mr. Strathmore. Please forgive the total misunderstanding. We had absolutely no idea who you were. He turned violently to his men and aggressively gestured for them to drop the velvet barrier. Step aside right now, he barked at the confused guards. Open the main doors immediately. The other guards scrambled in a pure panic to unhook the heavy red rope. They pulled the towering glass doors wide open, bowing their heads slightly as I walked past. I took my legal deed, folded it neatly along the creases, and slipped it safely back into my inside jacket pocket. I did not thank them for their compliance. I simply walked straight past them, leaving the cold night air behind, and stepped directly into the grand marble foyer of my own massive building. The inside of the corporate headquarters was absolutely spectacular. The Beaumont Global Gala was taking place in the massive open-glass atrium on the ground floor. The sheer amount of money Edmund had wasted on this illusion was staggering. Hundreds of wealthy investors, influential politicians, and high society elites were happily mingling under towering exotic floral arrangements and massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in white coats carried silver trays loaded with incredibly expensive champagne and imported caviar. Soft classical music echoed off the polished marble walls. It was a perfect, flawless picture of absolute corporate royalty and untouched wealth. I stayed in the dark shadows near the back of the massive room, leaning against a cold marble pillar. I quietly observed the fake empire I was about to completely and ruthlessly destroy. I saw wealthy men laughing and shaking hands, completely unaware that the ground they were standing on was about to completely collapse. Before I reveal what happened next at that grand corporate gala, comment the number 84 below if you're still watching the same table they thought I belonged at. Let me know you're still here with me. And just a gentle reminder, the next part of this story includes some dramatized elements for storytelling impact. If that's not your preference, feel free to step away here. The soft, classical music dissolved mid-note. One by one, the warm, ambient lights that bathed the massive glass atrium dimmed into darkness. Conversations quieted instinctively. A single blinding white spotlight sliced through the shadows and fixed itself on the grand stage erected at the far end of the room. The applause began immediately, polite, controlled, reverent. Edmund Beaumont stepped into the light, as if he had been born for it. He wore a flawless, custom tuxedo tailored to perfection. His silver hair was styled immaculately. His smile, wide-polished, nauseatingly confident, gleamed beneath the spotlight. He walked toward the crystal podium with the relaxed arrogance of a man who believed the world belonged to him. He paused, soaking in the admiration of the city's wealthiest investors, politicians, and corporate elites. He had no idea the executioner had already entered the room. Edmund raised a tall flute of golden champagne high above his head. The murmurs of the crowd softened into complete silence. "Thank you all for joining us this evening," he began, his voice booming confidently through the overhead speakers. "Tonight is not merely the celebration of a prosperous fiscal year. It marks the dawn of a new era for Beaumont Global." Scattered nods of approval moved through the sea of tuxedos and silk gowns. "As you know," he continued, "the logistics industry is a battlefield. Only the strongest, most visionary leaders survive. And I am proud to stand before you tonight to declare our empire is stronger than ever." Elegant applause filled the atrium. From the back of the room, I watched quietly. "We have secured the future of this company," Edmund said, his chest swelling with theatrical pride. "With our newly negotiated 10-year lease on this magnificent headquarters and our upcoming merger, we have guaranteed stability for decades to come. Beaumont Global is untouchable. We are the kings of this city." He lifted his glass again. "To power, to legacy, to family." 900 crystal glasses rose in unison. It was the perfect peak, the exact moment before gravity returned. I stepped out of the shadows. My shoes made no sound against the polished marble as I moved into the center aisle. I did not hurry. I walked with slow, deliberate precision, the pace of a man who understood ownership. The air carried expensive perfume and roasted meats, but beneath it I sensed something else. Fragility. As I advanced, the crowd parted instinctively. They saw the midnight blue fabric of my bespoke suit. They felt the quiet authority in my posture. They did not recognize me, but they recognized power. Just days ago, I had stood in a ballroom corner beside kitchen doors, wearing a rented tuxedo that pinched my shoulders. Tonight, the ocean of silk and diamonds divided for me. Edmund took another arrogant sip of champagne, and then his eyes drifted down the aisle. He froze mid-swallow. The crystal glass lowered slowly from his lips. Recognition flickered across his face, followed immediately by confusion. His mind struggled to reconcile the image before him. The broke mechanic from his son's wedding, walking confidently toward his stage in a $10,000 suit. The applause faded into uncertain silence as guests followed his stare. "What is the meaning of this?" Edmund demanded sharply into the microphone. His finger trembled as he pointed toward me. "How did you get in here, Strathmore?" 900 heads turned in synchronized motion. I did not stop walking. "Security!" Edmund barked, his voice cracking slightly. "Remove this man immediately. He's a trespasser. Drag him out." From the side of the atrium, the head of security stepped forward, flanked by 4 imposing guards. Edmund's lips curled into a desperate smile. He anticipated spectacle, humiliation, redemption. Instead, the security chief halted at the edge of the stage. He glanced at Edmund, then he looked at me. He folded his arms across his broad chest and planted his boots firmly into the marble. "We cannot do that, Mr. Beaumont," he said evenly. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Edmund slammed his fist against the crystal podium, knocking over his champagne glass. Sticky liquid spilled across his speech notes. "What do you mean you cannot?" he shouted. "I pay your salary. I am ordering you." The security chief did not flinch. "You no longer pay my salary, sir," he replied calmly. "And I advise you to lower your voice. You are addressing the legal owner of this property." The gasp that swept across the atrium was audible. Edmund staggered back as though struck. His mouth opened, but no words emerged. I reached the base of the stage and ascended the carpeted steps without hesitation. Edmund stood frozen. Sweat gathered at his temples. I stopped in front of him and gently removed the microphone from his unsteady hand. Then I turned toward the audience. 900 of the city's most powerful individuals stared at me in stunned silence. "Good evening," I said smoothly. My voice carried effortlessly through the towering glass chamber. "My name is Silas Strathmore." I paused. Moments ago, Mr. Beaumont announced he secured a 10-year lease on this building to guarantee his company's future. I let the words linger. There is just one problem with that statement. Edmund's breathing grew audible through the microphone he no longer held. The lease renewal, I continued calmly, was denied. A collective murmur rose. "This building is owned by Apex Holdings," I said, allowing the name to settle into their awareness. Apex Holdings has chosen not to extend Beaumont Global's tenancy. The silence thickened. Edmund lunged forward slightly. "That's absurd." I raised a hand. "It is also worth noting," I added, "that Beaumont Global is currently in default on multiple high-interest commercial loans." Across the room, several investors stiffened. "Those loans," I said, "have recently changed hands." Jonathan's legal team moved quietly along the perimeter, distributing sealed envelopes to select board members and financial backers. "I now hold controlling interest in the debt obligations of Beaumont Global." The air seemed to thin. Edmund's face drained of color. "You're lying," he whispered hoarsely. "No," I replied evenly. "I am collecting." At that moment, 2 federal officers approached the side of the stage. Their credentials flashed briefly under the lights. Gasps intensified. Edmund turned toward them, panic finally overtaking arrogance. "What is this?" he stammered. "Mr. Beaumont," one officer announced clearly, "we have documentation regarding corporate fraud and financial misrepresentation requiring immediate review." The applause from minutes earlier felt like a distant memory. Bradley near the bar stood rigid. His gaze darted toward the exits. Outside, eviction notices were already being prepared. Inside, cameras continued flashing, no longer celebratory but ravenous. I stepped slightly aside to allow the officers closer access to Edmund. "This evening was meant to celebrate stability," I said quietly into the microphone. "Instead, it will mark accountability." Edmund looked at me with pure disbelief. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I already have." The orchestra had fallen silent. The champagne glasses lowered slowly. The kings of the city stood exposed beneath unforgiving light. For years I had hidden in plain sight, allowing men like Edmund to mistake humility for weakness. Tonight, there were no shadows left to hide in. The lease was denied, the debt consolidated, the illusion dismantled. And as the weight of reality settled upon the room, I felt no triumph, only completion. The man who once sat at table 84 had returned not for applause, not for validation, but to correct a balance. And under the harsh white glare of the spotlight, the empire built on arrogance finally began to crumble. I slipped my hand into my pocket and pressed a single button on my encrypted phone. High above the ballroom, inside the discreetly concealed technical booth, Jonathan Reed executed the command without hesitation. The massive digital screen behind the stage seconds ago, glowing proudly with the polished Beaumont Global logo, flickered once, then went black. A heartbeat later, it illuminated again. This time, a towering high-definition image of a certified legal deed filled the 30-foot screen. The document was crisp, official, undeniable. Every signature, every embossed seal, every line of legal authority was magnified large enough for every guest in the ballroom to read with absolute clarity. A collective murmur rippled outward. I turned and pointed toward the glowing screen. What Edmund neglected to mention to his board members and valued investors, I said, my voice amplified smoothly through the sound system, is that he never secured that 10-year lease. I paused deliberately. Because Apex Holdings owns this entire skyscraper. The words hung in the air like a suspended blade. And yesterday afternoon, I continued evenly. I formally denied Beaumont Global's lease renewal and issued a 24-hour commercial eviction notice. The ballroom erupted. The refined atmosphere shattered into a chaotic symphony of gasps, frantic whispers, and the sudden glow of 100 phone screens. Investors scrambled to check stock prices. Assistants rushed to text legal teams. Brokers stepped into corners, whispering urgently into headsets. Behind me, Edmund stood frozen. Sweat gathered along his temples. His breathing became shallow, uneven. "But the deception does not end with the building," I said, raising my voice just enough to slice through the mounting panic. "Edmund assured you his company was financially untouchable. He promised you a lucrative merger that would secure your investments." I pressed the button again. The screen shifted. Now it displayed a detailed financial ledger stamped with official federal banking seals. Columns of numbers glowed under the bright projection lights. A bold red figure dominated the center. $15 million outstanding corporate debt. Beneath that number, in unmistakable type, appeared the name of the sole acquiring entity, Apex Holdings. "Look carefully," I commanded. The room fell into tense silence as eyes lifted toward the screen. "Beaumont Global is insolvent," I stated plainly. "For the past 6 months, it has survived on high-interest loans, fraudulent accounting, and borrowed credibility." A few gasps escaped. "As of yesterday morning," I continued, "Apex Holdings purchased every outstanding loan, every commercial credit line, and every piece of corporate debt attached to this company." I turned slowly to face Edmund. The man who had once radiated theatrical confidence now looked hollow. His tailored tuxedo hung awkwardly on his trembling frame. The spotlight, once flattering, now exposed every bead of sweat and every flicker of fear. "You do not have an empire, Edmund," I said quietly, though the microphone captured each syllable with surgical precision. "You do not have a legacy. You do not even have a place to sit tomorrow morning." The crowd's mood shifted from confusion to fury. These were not sentimental individuals. They were hardened financiers, politicians, power brokers, and they had just realized they'd been deceived. They understood now that Edmund did not own the building. He did not own the assets he had paraded before them. He did not even control the debt strangling his company. I did, and as that realization took hold, the energy in the room darkened. Near the rear glass doors, a sudden commotion broke out. Security personnel shifted positions. Legal representatives began entering quietly, escorted by officers in conservative suits. The execution was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding. I stepped forward, centering myself on the stage while chaos roared below. Edmund's supporters were turning away. Board members were already distancing themselves. Political allies refused eye contact. I raised the microphone again. "You have 24 hours, I announced clearly. The shouting softened just enough for the words to carry. "By 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, private security teams under Apex Holdings authority will permanently secure this building. Every office, every server, every desk and file cabinet within these walls is now collateral against your defaulted debt." Edmund stared at me, his eyes bloodshot. "You may remove your personal belongings," I continued evenly. "Clothing, family photographs, nothing else." The investors' anger intensified. Demands erupted: lawsuits, restitution, emergency board votes. Edmund looked out over the crowd he once commanded. He saw betrayal in their faces. He saw calculation. He saw survival instinct. The politicians who once shook his hand were already retreating. Board members typed furiously, preparing public statements to protect themselves. Advisors moved subtly toward the exits. His kingdom was dissolving in real time, built on vanity, sustained by deception, now collapsing under scrutiny. I lowered the microphone slightly and met his gaze one final time. This was not about revenge. It was about consequence. Edmund's chest rose and fell rapidly beneath his silk lapels. The confidence that once defined him had evaporated completely. He was no longer a titan. He was a debtor. And he stood in a building he did not own, surrounded by people who now understood that everything he promised them was smoke. The spotlight above us still burned white and merciless. For a moment I allowed the silence between us to stretch. Then I stepped back from the podium. The screen behind me remained illuminated with the ledger, bright red numbers glowing like an open wound. Security shifted subtly toward Edmund. Legal representatives approached the stage steps. The gala decorations, champagne towers, silk drapes, crystal chandeliers suddenly felt hollow. Decorative, temporary, just like his empire. As the crowd surged forward in outrage and disbelief, I felt nothing but calm. The illusion was gone, the balance had been corrected, and the fall loud, humiliating public had only just begun. The absolute humiliation of being publicly dismantled by the man he had thrown out of his son's wedding was finally breaking his mind. You did this to me!" Edmund screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysterical rage. He completely lost whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. "You ruined my family, Strathmore. You are a dead man." Edmund lowered his head and aggressively lunged forward. He threw his entire body weight toward me, swinging his heavy fists in a desperate attempt to physically destroy the man who had just erased his existence. I did not step back. I did not flinch or raise my hands to protect my face. I simply stood my ground in my bespoke blue suit, completely unafraid of a broken coward. Before Edmund could even close the short distance between us, a massive force suddenly hit him from the side. 3 men wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow federal letters printed across the back violently tackled him to the polished wooden floor of the stage. The heavy thud of his body hitting the ground echoed loudly through the ballroom speakers. From the dark shadows on the left side of the grand stage, Jonathan Reed calmly walked out into the bright white spotlight. He was carrying his sleek leather briefcase and adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked down at Edmund, who was currently pinned face down against the floor by the federal marshals. "Now, you are a very difficult man to serve papers to, Mr. Beaumont." Jonathan said, his voice dripping with absolute professional disdain. "But I thought this grand celebration would be the perfect venue to deliver the final blow." The federal marshals aggressively pulled Edmund's arms behind his back and secured heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Edmund groaned in pain, struggling weakly against the overwhelming force of the federal agents. Jonathan unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal warrants. He turned to address the shocked and silent crowd of wealthy investors. "My name is Jonathan Reed," he announced clearly. "I am the senior legal counsel for Apex Holdings. The men currently holding Edmund Beaumont are federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. We have spent the last 48 hours handing over mountains of irrefutable digital evidence proving that Mr. Beaumont has been actively committing massive corporate fraud for over 5 years. He has embezzled millions of dollars from your own employee pension funds and forged commercial documents to secure illegal high-interest loans. He is not just completely bankrupt. He is a massive federal criminal." The investors in the room gasped in total horror. The angry shouting completely stopped, replaced by the terrifying realization of absolute financial ruin. Several executives in the front row immediately pulled out their glowing smartphones and frantically opened their live stock trading applications. I watched their faces turn completely white. The financial news networks had just broken the story of the federal raid and the massive corporate debt default. Beaumont Global was a publicly traded company that relied entirely on investor confidence. With the chief executive officer handcuffed on stage and the corporate headquarters officially seized by my holding company, that confidence completely evaporated in a matter of seconds. "Look at your screens," I told the crowd, my voice echoing through the massive room. "Look at the legacy this man built." The stock price of Beaumont Global, which had been hovering at a respectable $80 a share that very morning, began to violently plummet in real time. It dropped to $40, then $20, then $10. Panic selling flooded the global market. Within 3 short minutes, the stock completely flatlined at exactly $0. The company was officially completely worthless. Edmund was violently hauled to his feet by the federal marshals. His expensive custom tuxedo was heavily wrinkled and covered in dust from the stage floor. His slick hair hung in sweaty strands across his forehead. He looked absolutely pathetic. He looked like a man who finally realized that he was going to spend the rest of his miserable life locked inside a tiny concrete cell. "Pstia, take him away," Jonathan ordered, waving his hand dismissively. "He is ruining the aesthetic of my client's building." It was the exact same cruel phrase Edmund had used against me at the wedding reception just a few days ago. Hearing it repeated back to him in front of his wealthy peers was the absolute final nail in his coffin. Edmund did not fight back anymore. He hung his head in total defeat, sobbing quietly as the federal agents dragged him down the stage stairs and marched him straight down the center aisle. The crowd of elite guests immediately parted for him, but this time they were not bowing in respect. They were backing away in total disgust, treating him exactly like the toxic garbage he truly was. I stood on the stage and watched the heavy glass doors close behind him. The architect of my public humiliation was completely gone, but my work was not entirely finished. The father had just paid for his blinding arrogance, but the son still needed to answer for his massive theft. The grand ballroom was in a state of absolute chaos. Investors were screaming into their cell phones, running desperately toward the exits to call their financial advisors. Women in expensive silk gowns were nervously gathering their imported purses, eager to escape the massive crime scene. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage, letting my cold eyes slowly scan the rapidly moving crowd. I was looking for one specific rat trying to flee the sinking ship. I found him near the back service exit. Bradley Beaumont was completely drenched in nervous sweat. He had watched his untouchable father get dragged away in heavy steel handcuffs. He had watched his family fortune completely evaporate into thin air. And he knew exactly what was coming for him next. The violent loan sharks from the Macau syndicate were already actively hunting him across the city. And now his only source of protective wealth was entirely gone. He was trying to quietly slip through the swinging wooden doors that led to the catering kitchen, hoping to disappear into the dark city streets before I noticed him. He was trying to run away, just like he always did whenever his massive gambling debts caught up with him. I raised the heavy microphone to my mouth. "Bradley Beaumont." I called out, my voice booming like thunder across the chaotic room. Bradley completely froze. He was standing exactly where I had been sitting at his wedding reception. He was standing right next to the dark corner table where his father had thrown freezing ice water into my face. He slowly turned around, his face completely pale and his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Do not try to walk out that back door, Bradley," I said loudly, ensuring that every single remaining person in the grand ballroom could hear my words. "Howilon, you and I have some very serious unfinished business to discuss. Let us talk about the $100,000 you and my daughter stole from me. And let us talk about the men waiting outside for you right now." Bradley stood completely frozen by the heavy wooden service doors. The remaining crowd in the grand ballroom turned their attention away from the empty stage and focused entirely on the terrified young man in the designer tuxedo. I walked slowly down the carpeted stairs of the stage and moved down the center aisle toward him. Every single step I took echoed in the cavernous space. The federal marshals who had just dragged his father away were still standing near the entrance, blocking the main exits. Bradley was trapped like a rat in a glass cage. I stopped 10 feet away from him. He was sweating so heavily that his expensive silk collar was completely soaked. He looked at me, not with the arrogant sneer he had worn yesterday morning, but with the wide, terrified eyes of a child who had just been caught stealing. "You really believed you could slip out the back door, Bradley," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the stunned silence of the ballroom. "You thought you could let your father stand here and absorb the fallout for his corporate fraud, while you quietly disappeared into the night." Bradley froze near the service exit, his hand still hovering inches from the door handle. "But you and I both know," I continued, evenly taking one deliberate step toward him, "that Edmund Beaumont is not the only criminal in this family." A murmur rippled through the guests who had remained behind to witness the unraveling. Bradley swallowed hard. His eyes flicked toward the federal agents stationed near the exits, then back to me. The color had drained completely from his face. "Silas, please," he whispered hoarsely. His voice trembled so violently it barely carried across the marble floor. "Please don't do this here. We can talk about this privately. Whatever you want, we can fix it." I shook my head once. "We passed the point of privacy days ago," I replied. "You forfeited that privilege the moment you publicly humiliated me at your wedding reception. And you forfeited any expectation of mercy the moment you decided to steal what you believed was my life savings." The crowd leaned in, hungry for clarity. I turned, slightly ensuring the microphone carried every word to the back of the cavernous room. "2 nights ago, I announced clearly my daughter and this man drained my civilian checking account. They forged my signature on a joint withdrawal slip. They committed federal wire fraud and transferred $100,000 out of my account." Gasps rose from the investors. They believed they were taking the final dollar from a tired old blue-collar worker, I continued. "And why did they steal it? Because Bradley Beaumont is not a visionary businessman. He is a gambling addict. He owed $500,000 to a violent international loan shark syndicate operating out of Macau." Bradley closed his eyes and let out a broken, involuntary sound. His carefully curated high society composure disintegrated in seconds. "That $100,000, I said, stepping closer to him, was only a temporary payment to prevent those men from breaking your legs." Bradley's breathing grew shallow. "You still owed $500,000. The room was silent now. No whispers, no movement. "And this afternoon," I continued calmly, "while you were sipping champagne at your exclusive country club, 3 representatives from that syndicate joined you at your table." Bradley's knees buckled. He stumbled backward into the heavy service doors, catching himself with shaking hands. How do you know about that?" he gasped. I allowed myself the faintest smile. "Because I sent them." A collective intake of breath filled the room. "Yesterday afternoon, Apex Holdings purchased your gambling markers in full. I bought your debt, Bradley. You no longer owe the Macau syndicate." I let the silence stretch. "You owe me." The words landed like a verdict. "I am calling that debt due," I said quietly. "Right here. Right now." The terror that spread across his face was unmistakable. The young man who once mocked me in my own daughter's home now understood that the power dynamic had shifted completely. His father's empire was ash. His credit was gone. His escape routes sealed. Before he could form another plea, a shrill voice tore through the tension. "Leave him alone." Heads turned sharply. Arabella burst through the crowd, shoving past stunned investors. Her silk gown shimmered under the lights, its elegance clashing violently with the fury on her face. Tears streaked her makeup, but her eyes burned with defiance. She rushed to Bradley's side and positioned herself in front of him, shielding him as if he were the victim. "Stop this, Dad," she shouted, pointing at me. "Stop trying to destroy my husband." Her voice echoed off the glass walls. "You're doing this because you're bitter," she continued, shaking. "Because Edmund embarrassed you. Because you can't stand that we moved on to something better." I looked at my daughter. In that moment, she did not see her father. She saw an enemy threatening her fantasy. "I am not destroying him, Arabella," I said calmly. "He destroyed himself, and he dragged you into the wreckage." "He's not a criminal?" she cried. "He just made some bad investments. He committed wire fraud," I replied evenly. "You helped him do it. You forged my name. You transferred stolen money to violent criminals." She folded her arms tightly across her chest, refusing to absorb the truth. "We needed help," she screamed. "Brad loves me. We're building something real. We used your money because you were never going to use it anyway. You sit alone in that tiny house doing nothing with your life." Each word cut, but not the way she intended. "He's going to pay you back," she insisted desperately. "As soon as the corporate deal closes. We're a team." I studied her for a long moment. The anger, the delusion, the blind loyalty to a man who had treated her as collateral. "Arabella," I said softly, "he does not love you." "Yes, he does," she screamed, stamping her heel against the marble floor. You don't know anything about us. You don't know anything about love. Her voice cracked on the last word. You're just a bitter old man who wants to ruin the only good thing that ever happened to me. I exhaled slowly. There are moments when words fail, moments when reality must speak for itself. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew the black encrypted phone. I had hoped I would not need it, but hope had already cost enough. Without another argument, I unlocked the device and opened the audio file recorded in Edmund's mansion the morning before. I raised the phone toward the microphone still in my hand. Then I pressed play. The sound filled the ballroom with startling clarity. My recorded voice emerged, first measured submissive. That's a beautiful watch, Bradley. Did you buy that with the $100,000 you and Arabella took from my bank account last night? A beat of silence. Then Bradley's laughter, cruel, unrestrained. It's a wedding gift to myself, old man, his recorded voice boasted. Consider it an investment in your daughter's future. She belongs to the Beaumont family now. Your pathetic life savings finally served a real purpose. A ripple of disgust swept through the audience. The recording continued. You were going to rot in that tiny house anyway, his voice sneered. Arabella's body went rigid. Her fury evaporated in an instant. She slowly turned her head toward Bradley. He stood motionless, staring at the phone in my hand, as if it were a weapon. Color drained from her face. The audio played on his admission of the forged signature. His laughter at the theft. His pride in spending the money. Each word landed like a hammer. The illusion shattered in real time. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Arabella stepped away from him unconsciously. The ballroom remained utterly silent. 900 witnesses to the truth. I lowered the phone. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply looked at my daughter. Love does not sound like that, I said quietly. Her eyes filled with tears, not of anger this time, but recognition. Behind her, federal agents stepped forward. Bradley's hands trembled violently. The fantasy had collapsed. The truth stood exposed. And in the center of that shattered ballroom, beneath the cold glare of unforgiving lights, there were no more lies left to hide behind. Arabella forged my signature, Bradley, my voice said on the tape. That is federal wire fraud. Why did you make her do that to her own father? Why did you steal everything I had left in the world? Then came the absolute devastating kill shot. Bradley's recorded voice, completely relaxed and completely merciless, echoed through the grand atrium. I did not make her do anything, Strathmore, he bragged. Arabella is a smart girl, but she is a completely gullible pawn. I only married her because I knew you had that retirement money sitting around, and I needed liquid cash to get the syndicate off my back. She did the creative accounting. She signed the withdrawal slip and the money vanished. I used her to get to your money. She actually thinks we are building a life together. You are never seeing a single dime of it again. I pressed the stop button on the phone. The heavy silence that followed was completely suffocating. I lowered the phone and looked directly at Arabella. The bright, arrogant fire in her eyes was completely extinguished. All the color had drained from her beautiful face. Her lips were trembling violently. She realized in one single devastating moment that her entire marriage, her grand social elevation, and her supposed true love were all completely fake. She had thrown away her devoted father and committed a massive federal crime for a man who openly considered her a gullible pawn and a human bank account. She slowly turned to face Bradley. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Brad, she whispered, her voice completely broken. Tell me that is not true. Tell me you did not just marry me for his money. Bradley did not look at her with love. He did not look at her with remorse. He looked at her like a wild, trapped animal looking for a distraction. He knew the federal marshals blocking the main exits had heard the recorded confession. He knew the syndicate men were waiting for him outside the building. He was completely out of time and completely out of options. The heavy glass doors at the front of the ballroom suddenly burst open. 3 men wearing dark, tailored suits walked into the massive atrium. They were the operatives from the Macau syndicate, the men I now completely controlled. They spotted Bradley near the back service exit and immediately began walking toward him with dark, violent intent. Bradley's eyes widened in total absolute panic. He saw the dangerous men approaching. He saw the federal agents moving in from the sides. Bratti, Arabella cried out, reaching out to grab his expensive suit jacket. "Please tell me you love me." Bradley looked at the woman who had just sacrificed her entire life for him. He did not hesitate for a single second. He raised his hands, shoved Arabella violently in the chest, and threw her completely out of his way. Arabella gasped in pain as she fell hard onto the polished marble floor, tearing her expensive silk gown and scraping her knees. Bradley did not even look down at her. He completely abandoned his wife, scrambling desperately toward the heavy wooden service doors. He pushed through the swinging doors and ran blindly into the dark alleyway behind the massive skyscraper. He left her completely alone on the cold, hard floor of the grand ballroom. The wealthy elite guests stared down at her with absolute pity and disgust. The police sirens began to wail loudly in the distance, rapidly approaching the corporate headquarters. The massive web had completely closed. The Beaumont family was utterly destroyed, and my daughter was left sitting in the ruins of her own blinding greed, weeping uncontrollably as the federal agents slowly swarmed into the room to arrest her. It was exactly 1 week later. The chaotic dust of the massive corporate execution had finally settled, leaving nothing but the completely ruined ashes of the Beaumont family empire. I was no longer living in the small, cramped suburban house with the cracked concrete driveway. That house was a disguise I no longer needed to wear. I had officially moved into the primary residence of the Apex Holdings Private Trust. It was a sprawling 200-acre secluded estate located deep in the lush green hills outside the city. The main house was a massive architectural masterpiece constructed from imported white stone and dark, heavy timber. It was surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, towering oak trees, and a massive private security wall. For the first time in 10 long years, I was finally living in the absolute reality of my own immense wealth. I sat on the wide stone terrace overlooking a pristine private lake. The morning air was incredibly crisp and clean. I held a warm cup of black coffee and read the morning financial newspapers. The front pages were completely dominated by the spectacular downfall of Edmund Beaumont. The federal justice system had moved with absolute ruthless efficiency. 2 days ago, Edmund was hauled into a federal courthouse wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. His expensive corporate defense attorneys had completely abandoned him the exact moment they realized his bank accounts were entirely frozen by my legal team. He was assigned an exhausted court-appointed lawyer who could do absolutely nothing to save him. The federal judge took one single look at the massive mountain of irrefutable digital evidence Jonathan had provided and completely denied Edmund's request for bail. He deemed the disgraced chief executive a massive flight risk. Edmund was currently locked inside a tiny, cold concrete cell in the federal penitentiary, waiting for a criminal trial that would undoubtedly put him behind bars for the rest of his miserable natural life. Beaumont Global was completely dissolved, and its assets were actively being liquidated by my holding company. And Bradley Beaumont had proven himself to be the ultimate pathetic coward. The exact moment he ran out the back doors of the grand ballroom, leaving his new wife crying on the marble floor, he vanished entirely. He knew the dangerous operatives from the Macau syndicate were actively hunting him, and he knew the Federal Financial Crimes Division was right behind them. He stole a luxury sports car from the valet lot and drove recklessly across state lines, abandoning his entire life. He left Arabella completely alone to face the devastating legal and financial consequences of the massive federal wire fraud they had committed together. The heavy intercom sitting on my outdoor stone table suddenly buzzed, breaking the absolute morning silence. It was the commander of my private security detail, stationed at the massive iron gates 2 miles down the private road. He informed me that a young woman was standing outside the gates, frantically begging to be let inside. I pressed a button on my digital tablet and pulled up the high-definition live feed from the front gate security cameras. It was Arabella, The transformation was completely staggering. She was no longer the arrogant, entitled, high society princess who had cruelly demanded $50,000 for a luxury vacation to Dubai. She was wearing a pair of dirty gray sweatpants and a faded, oversized sweater. Her expensive hair extensions were tangled and completely unkempt. Her face was pale, exhausted, and heavily stained with dark streaks of ruined makeup. She looked exactly like a desperate, terrified fugitive who had not slept in days. "Open the main gates," I told my security chief through the intercom. "Let her walk through, but do not offer her a ride in the security vehicles. Make her walk the entire 2 miles up the main driveway." I sat calmly on the stone terrace and watched the security monitors as my daughter slowly trudged up the long, winding paved road. The steep incline and the physical exhaustion clearly took a massive toll on her. It took her nearly 45 minutes to reach the main house. By the time she finally walked up the grand stone steps and stepped onto the wide terrace, she was completely out of breath and physically shaking. She stopped dead in her tracks when she reached the edge of the patio. Her wide, terrified eyes slowly took in the sheer, massive scale of the Salationnaire estate. She saw the towering stone columns, the cascading water features, and the pristine fleet of imported luxury vehicles parked quietly in the circular motor court. The absolute, undeniable reality of my hidden empire finally crashed down upon her. She realized in that exact moment that the wealth she had desperately chased by marrying into the fraudulent Beaumont family was absolutely pathetic compared to the true immense power sitting calmly right in front of her. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking violently with pure exhaustion and overwhelming regret. "I have been trying to find you all week. I went to the old house, but it was completely empty. The neighbors said you packed up and left in the middle of the night. I had to illegally access the Apex Holdings corporate registry just to find this private address." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I did not stand up to greet her. I did not offer her a comfortable chair or a glass of water. I simply looked at her with cold, detached eyes. "State your business, Arabella," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any paternal warmth. She fell forward, dropping heavily to her knees on the hard stone patio. She covered her face with her trembling hands and began to weep hysterically. The sound of her crying echoed loudly across the quiet estate. "Brad left me," she wailed, her shoulders shaking violently. "He completely abandoned me at the gala and disappeared. The federal police came to my house yesterday morning. They kicked down the front door and confiscated all of my computers, my cell phone, and my personal financial records. The bank officially foreclosed on the mansion and evicted me because you canceled the premium mortgage. I have absolutely nowhere to go and absolutely no money left to my name. The federal agents explicitly told me I am going to be officially indicted for massive wire fraud by the end of the week. My friends from the country club completely blocked my phone number. Everyone abandoned me. You have to help me, Dad. You have to hire the most expensive corporate lawyers in the city to keep me out of federal prison. Please just let me move into this massive house. There are so many empty rooms here. I can hide safely behind your security walls until the media completely forgets about the scandal and the charges go away." I looked down at the weeping woman kneeling on my expensive stone floor. A week ago, seeing my only child in this much agonizing pain would have absolutely shattered my heart. I would have rushed forward, picked her up off the ground, and promised to use every single dollar I possessed to protect her from the cruel world. But the father who would have done that was completely dead. He died the exact second she turned her back on him, while freezing ice water dripped from his face. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored jacket. I pulled out a small piece of cheap printed cardstock. I stood up from my chair, walked slowly over to her, and dropped the card directly onto the stone floor right in front of her knees. Arabella slowly lowered her hands and looked down at the card. It was not the sleek, embossed gold business card of Jonathan Reed or any other high-powered, expensive corporate defense attorney. It was a generic black and white printed contact card for the local county public defender office. "What is this?" she whispered, staring at the cheap paper in total, absolute horror. "That is the direct phone number for the overworked state lawyer who is going to represent you in federal court," I said, my voice slicing through the morning air like a cold steel blade. "You made a conscious, greedy decision to commit a massive federal crime to fund a completely fake luxury lifestyle. You actively chose to steal your father's life savings to protect a cowardly fraud. You watched an arrogant monster publicly humiliate me in front of 900 people, and you completely abandoned me just to save your own pathetic social status." Arabella looked up at me, her eyes wide with absolute blinding panic. She reached out and desperately grabbed the bottom edge of my expensive suit trousers. "Dad, please," she begged, sobbing uncontrollably. "I am your only daughter. I am your own flesh and blood. You cannot just leave me to go to a concrete prison cell. You have hundreds of millions of dollars. You own an entire global empire. You can easily make all of these federal charges completely go away with a single phone call. I am so incredibly sorry. I will do whatever you want." I looked down at her desperate, trembling hands gripping my dark wool trousers. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her fingers off my clothing, pushing her hands away. "I raised a daughter," I said, staring directly into her terrified, weeping eyes. "I raised a girl who understood the profound value of hard work and absolute loyalty. But looking at the greedy, lying thief sitting on my patio right now, I have absolutely no idea who you are. The daughter I raised would never have sold her soul and destroyed her family for a cheap gold watch and a fraudulent mansion. You are not my daughter anymore. You are simply a federal criminal looking for a wealthy bailout." I took a step backward, completely severing the absolute final tie between us. "Get off my property, Arabella," I commanded, my voice echoing with total, unquestionable authority. "And if you ever try to contact me or step foot near this estate ever again, I will have my armed security team immediately arrest you for criminal trespassing." I turned my back on her and walked calmly toward the main house. I opened the heavy, soundproof glass doors and stepped inside my quiet, peaceful home. I closed the doors firmly behind me, completely shutting out the chaotic sounds of her desperate, hysterical sobbing. I did not look back. I walked directly into my private study and sat down at my massive mahogany desk. The violent storm of the Beaumont family was finally completely over, but there was still one absolute final piece of business left to complete before I could truly embrace my new life. 6 months have passed since the night the Beaumont empire completely collapsed into dust. The transition from the bitter cold winter to the warm, bright spring brought a profound sense of absolute renewal to my massive private estate. I was sitting in a heavy wooden rocking chair on my expansive back porch, watching the morning sun slowly rise over the calm surface of my private lake. The morning air was incredibly peaceful and completely still. There were no loud arguments echoing through the hallways. There were no arrogant demands for expensive vacations or luxury cars. There were absolutely no toxic parasites pretending to be my family just to drain my bank accounts. I was completely alone on my 200-acre property, and for the very first time in over a decade, I was completely and totally free. I rested my warm cup of black coffee on the small wooden table next to me and picked up my glowing digital tablet. Jonathan, my trusted corporate attorney, sent me a detailed executive summary every single morning regarding the ongoing legal fallout of the Beaumont family. I slowly scrolled through the final court reports from the federal justice system. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they ground incredibly fine. Yesterday afternoon, a federal judge officially slammed the heavy wooden gavel down on Edmund Beaumont. He was found guilty on 34 separate counts of massive corporate fraud, severe embezzlement, and international financial tampering. The report detailed how Edmund stood in the center of the federal courtroom, wearing a cheap, bright orange prison jumpsuit. He looked exactly like a broken, pathetic old man. All of his expensive, custom-tailored silk suits and his imported cologne were completely gone. He cried in front of the judge and desperately begged for mercy, claiming he was simply a victim of a hostile corporate takeover. The federal judge looked at the thousands of innocent lives Edmund had completely ruined by stealing employee pension funds to support his lavish lifestyle. The judge looked at the massive mountain of irrefutable digital evidence my holding company had provided and completely denied his pathetic request. Edmund was officially sentenced to 10 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He traded his 40-story glass skyscraper and his crystal champagne flutes for a tiny concrete cell and a metal toilet. He would be nearly 80 years old by the time he ever breathed free air again. His fake legacy, his impenetrable empire, was entirely erased from the face of the earth. I scrolled down the glowing screen to the next section of the legal report. Bradley Beaumont did not make it very far on his desperate run from the federal authorities and the violent underground syndicate. He managed to hide in cheap, dirty motels for a few short weeks, but a coward always eventually makes a stupid mistake. He was violently arrested by armed state troopers at a rundown gas station in rural Nevada. He was actively trying to use a stolen credit card to buy a cheap sandwich when the police tackled him to the dusty concrete. The police report noted that he wept uncontrollably in the back of the squad car. The federal authorities immediately extradited him back to our city. He was currently sitting in a cold county jail cell, completely terrified, waiting for his own massive federal fraud trial. The international loan sharks he owed $500,000 to were completely neutralized by my aggressive legal team, so his physical safety was no longer in jeopardy. But Bradley would still spend the absolute best years of his life locked inside a federal prison, wearing the same orange jumpsuit as his arrogant father. And then there was Arabella. I read the detailed update provided by the expensive private investigator I had hired, strictly to monitor her legal compliance and her living situation. She managed to barely avoid serving actual federal prison time by fully cooperating with the authorities. She turned over every single piece of digital evidence against Bradley and Edmund, detailing exactly how they forced her to commit the massive wire fraud. But her physical freedom came with a massive, suffocating price. The federal judge ordered her to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in strict financial restitution for her active role in stealing my money. She was completely stripped of her imported luxury cars, her custom designer clothes, and her elevated high society status. The bank had officially seized the massive luxury mansion she tried to buy with my forged signature. My private investigator reported that my daughter was currently living in a tiny, cramped apartment in the absolute worst and most dangerous part of the city. She had absolutely no college degree and a massive federal felony on her permanent public record. She was currently working grueling, exhausting night shifts as a waitress at a rundown 24-hour diner just to scrape together enough tips to meet her monthly court-mandated payments. I pictured her standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of that greasy diner. I pictured her wiping down sticky tables and dealing with rude, aggressive customers at 3 o'clock in the morning. I pictured her looking down at her bare hands, where her expensive diamond wedding ring used to be, realizing that her perfect fairy tale life was nothing but a devastating nightmare. It was a massive, catastrophic fall from the imported silk and the crystal chandeliers she had violently thrown me away to keep. I set the digital tablet face down on the wooden table. I looked out over the calm water of my beautiful lake. I did not smile. There was absolutely no joy in my heart, seeing my own flesh and blood reduced to scrubbing tables in the middle of the night just to survive. I did not feel a rush of vindictive glee, but I did feel a deep, profound, and completely unshakable sense of absolute peace. The natural order of the universe had been completely restored. Toxic actions finally had real devastating consequences. I had spent my entire life trying to softly shield Arabella from the harsh, brutal realities of the world. I had sacrificed my own happiness and lived like a ghost just to provide for her. And my endless unconditional sacrifice had only turned her into a greedy, entitled monster who viewed me as a disposable bank account. The universe was now providing the harsh, brutal education I had completely failed to give her. She was finally learning the true value of a single dollar through her own blood, sweat, and tears. The heavy, soundproof glass door behind me slid open smoothly. Jonathan walked onto the sunlit porch carrying his familiar dark leather briefcase. He looked completely relaxed and genuinely happy, a stark contrast to the high-stress environment we used to operate in when we were dismantling the Beaumont Empire. He walked over to my table and pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal documents. "Good morning, Silas," Jonathan said respectfully, placing a solid gold pen perfectly aligned next to the heavy papers. "I have the final restructuring documents for the Apex Holdings Primary Trust. Everything is set up exactly according to your specific and exact instructions." I picked up the heavy documents and carefully read through the executive summary on the first page. For years, I had hoarded my massive wealth in secret blind trusts, absolutely terrified that it would corrupt my family if they ever found out about it. Now that the camouflage was completely gone, I knew exactly what I needed to do with my massive financial empire. I was officially transferring 90% of my total net worth and all of my liquid corporate assets into a brand new charitable foundation. It was called the Strathmore Educational Trust. It was a massive global scholarship fund designed specifically to provide full-ride university tuitions, generous living stipends, and zero-interest business grants to underprivileged, incredibly hard-working young students. I was giving my hundreds of dollars to the kids who worked 14-hour shifts just to help their parents pay the rent. I was giving it to the single mothers attending night school under flickering streetlights. I was giving my wealth to the young people who possessed genuine moral character and a desperate hunger to improve the world. I was giving my entire empire to the people who actually understood the profound value of hard work, because they had to bleed for every single opportunity they ever received. I was investing in the children who would never throw freezing water in an old man's face. I picked up the gold pen and signed my legal name at the very bottom of the heavy document. As the ink dried on the paper, I felt an incredible heavy weight completely lift off my broad shoulders. The burden of hiding, the burden of toxic family, the burden of unappreciated sacrifice was completely gone. I handed the paperwork back to Jonathan. "It is officially done, Jonathan," I said, my voice steady, clear, and completely full of purpose. "Make sure the first massive round of scholarships goes out before the fall semester begins. Find the kids who are completely invisible to the wealthy elites. Give them the absolute power to change their own lives." Jonathan smiled a genuine warm smile. He packed the signed documents safely into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass lock shut. "It is an absolute honor to work for you, Silas," he said quietly before turning around and walking back into the quiet house. I sat alone on the massive porch and listened to the gentle morning breeze rustling through the towering green oak trees. I thought about the tight rented tuxedo, the freezing ice water, and the deafening mocking silence of that grand ballroom. I sat there thinking about the long road from a broken father to a man hardened by family betrayal and forced into family revenge. This is one of those grandpa stories, yes, but it is also a family story about pride, pain, and consequences. In many grandpa stories, and every painful family story, the line between love and weakness is thin. And to you listening to this story, remember this: God sees what people hide. God weighs the heart, not the status. And God allows consequences when we ignore wisdom. I trusted too much in silence and pride. I believed shielding my child from struggle would protect her soul. I was wrong. This was not just about family revenge. It was about repeated family betrayal. It was about how family betrayal, when ignored, grows into something poisonous. And when family revenge becomes the only language left, everyone loses something. If I could speak to you honestly, do not do what I did. Do not hide the truth from the people you love. Do not let fear of losing them make you small. Stand firm early, teach boundaries early, pray early. Ask God for discernment before the damage becomes irreversible. These grandpa stories and every family story you hear on this channel are not just drama, they are warnings. They show how family revenge and family betrayal begin quietly, with pride, with silence, with compromise. If this message spoke to you, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Share your thoughts respectfully. Subscribe if you value powerful grandpa stories and real-life family story lessons. Thank you for staying until the very end. And a gentle note, upcoming stories may include dramatized elements for educational purposes. If that is not for you, feel free to choose content that better suits your heart.